The metallic taste of blood mixed with hospital antiseptic as Laura's head throbbed against the cold linoleum floor. Her wheelchair lay twisted beside her at the bottom of the stairwell, one wheel still spinning lazily in the fluorescent light. The sound echoed off the concrete walls like a dying heartbeat, each rotation slower than the last, until silence consumed everything except her ragged breathing. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Help," she whispered, her voice barely a thread in the empty space. The word dissolved into nothing, swallowed by the institutional walls that had witnessed too many secrets, too many lies dressed as accidents. Above her, footsteps retreated, quick, deliberate, familiar. The same footsteps that had approached her wheelchair moments before, the same voice that had whispered, "You should have kept quiet, Lora. Some things are better left buried." But now, as pain shot through her ribs and her vision blurred at the edges, she wondered if anyone would believe what had really happened in this forgotten corner of St. Catherine's Hospital. The emergency stairwell connected the old wing to the new, a forgotten artery that most patients never saw. Lora had been wheeling herself back from her physical therapy session, taking the long route to avoid the crowded main corridor, where pitying glances followed her everywhere. The renovation had been going on for months, leaving this section practically abandoned except for the occasional maintenance worker or lost visitor. She preferred it that way. The solitude felt cleaner than the suffocating sympathy that clung to every other part of this place. Her sister Maya had appeared suddenly, materializing from the shadows near the stairwell entrance, like she'd been waiting. "There you are," she had said, her voice carrying that particular sweetness that had always preceded trouble. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Maya was 3 years older, blessed with the kind of effortless beauty that had always made Lora feel invisible even before the accident. Golden hair that caught light like spun silk, eyes the color of summer sky, and a smile that could convince anyone of anything. She'd been homecoming queen, valedictorian, the daughter who could do no wrong. Now she worked as a nurse practitioner in the very hospital where Lora came for treatment, a coincidence that everyone called fortunate, but felt more like a curse. "I brought you something," Maya had said, producing a small, wrapped package from her purse. "I know how much you love those lavender sachets from that little shop downtown. I thought they might help with your anxiety." The gesture should have been touching, but something in Maya's expression, a tightness around her eyes, a forced quality to her smile, had made Laura's stomach clench with unease. They had been having the same conversation for weeks now, Maya insisting that Lora was remembering things wrong, that grief and trauma could play tricks on memory. "You're being paranoid," she'd say with that patient, condescending tone reserved for children and invalids. Dr. Harrison confirmed it was an equipment malfunction. These things happen. But Lora remembered. She remembered the feeling of hands on her wheelchair, the sensation of being pushed rather than falling. She remembered the face she'd glimpsed in her rearview mirror attachment, a face that shouldn't have been there, couldn't have been there, according to everyone who mattered. The family had closed ranks around the official story like antibodies attacking an infection, protecting Maya's reputation, preserving the fiction that kept their world intact. "You need to let this go," Maya had said, stepping closer to the wheelchair. "Mom and Dad are worried sick about you. These delusions aren't healthy." "They're not delusions," Lora had replied, her voice stronger than she had felt in months. "I know what I saw." That's when Maya's mask had slipped, just for a moment. The sweetness drained from her face, replaced with something cold and calculating. "You don't know anything," she had whispered. "You never did." The memory fragmented as footsteps approached from below. Heavy boots on concrete, the jingle of keys, a flashlight beam cutting through the dim stairwell. Lora tried to call out again, but only managed a groan as her ribs protested the movement. "Jesus Christ," a deep voice muttered. Ma'am, can you hear me?" The beam found her face, and she squinted against the brightness. Behind it, she could make out the shape of a security uniform, broad shoulders, graying hair beneath a cap. Marcus Rodriguez. She recognized him from her countless visits to the hospital. He was one of the few staff members who actually looked at her instead of through her, who remembered her name and asked about her progress. Lora, what the hell happened? He was already on his radio, calling for medical assistance, his voice sharp with professional urgency. But when he knelt beside her, his tone softened. Don't try to move. Help's coming. My sister. Maya? She's here? Lora nodded weakly. She pushed me. Marcus's expression shifted, a shadow passing over his weathered features. He glanced up the stairwell, then back at her, and she saw something she didn't expect. Not surprise, but recognition, as if he'd been waiting for someone to say exactly what she'd just said. We'll talk about that later, he said quietly, positioning himself between her and the stairs. Right now, let's get you taken care of. The medical team arrived in a controlled chaos of concerned voices and practiced movements. Lora found herself lifted onto a stretcher, her broken wheelchair tagged as evidence, though evidence of what no one seemed willing to say out loud. As they wheeled her toward the elevator, she caught Marcus watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was something protective in his stance, something knowing in his eyes that made her wonder what other secrets these hospital walls had witnessed. In the elevator, one of the paramedics was explaining her injuries to someone on his radio. Possible concussion, definitely bruised ribs, minor lacerations, potential spinal compression that would need immediate evaluation. Clinical terms that reduced her terror to manageable categories. Her sister's betrayal to a series of symptoms that could be treated and discharged. Family's been notified. Sister's a staff member here. She's on her way down. Of course she was. Maya would arrive with tears in her eyes and trembling hands, playing the part of the devastated sister to perfection. She'd explain how Lora had been acting strangely lately, talking about impossible things, letting paranoia consume her rational mind. The family would nod gravely and discuss treatment options, maybe suggest psychiatric evaluation, anything to explain away the inconvenient truth that their golden daughter was capable of something monstrous. As the elevator doors opened onto the emergency department, Lora caught a glimpse of Maya rushing toward them, her face a masterpiece of concern and grief. But for just an instant, as their eyes met across the bustling corridor, Lora saw something entirely else. A flicker of calculation, a moment of assessment as Maya measured her success. The performance was about to begin, and Lora was the only one who knew they were watching a lie. The hospital room smelled like industrial sanitizer and recycled air, a familiar cocktail that had become the backdrop of Lora's existence for the past 18 months. Room 314 had become her second home since the original accident, the one that had left her paralyzed from the waist down and dependent on a wheelchair, that once had felt like a prison, but had gradually become her gateway back to independence. Now, lying in the narrow bed with fresh bandages wrapped around her ribs and a new catalog of injuries to add to her collection, she wondered if that gateway had been permanently sealed. The morning light filtered through blinds that never quite closed properly, casting alternating strips of brightness and shadow across the institutional green walls. Lora had memorized every crack in the paint, every water stain on the ceiling tiles, every sound that the old building made as it settled into another day. The breakfast cart would arrive at 7:30, pushed by Mrs. Chen, who always remembered that Lora preferred her coffee black and her toast barely golden. Dr. Harrison would make his rounds at 9, followed by the physical therapy assessment at 10:15. But today felt different. Today, she was no longer just another patient recovering from life's cruel randomness. She was a woman who claimed her sister had tried to kill her, and that changed everything about how people looked at her, spoke to her, existed around her. The MRI shows no additional spinal damage, Dr. Harrison was saying, his voice carrying that practice neutrality that doctors perfected over years of delivering both miracles and devastation. He was a thin man with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the sort of person who remembered his patients' birthdays and kept pictures of their children on his desk. The concussion is mild, and your ribs are bruised but not broken. Physically, you're going to be fine.
The word physically hung in the air between them like a question mark. Lora understood the implication. Her body would heal. But what about her mind? What about the story she'd told Marcus Rodriguez in the stairwell? The accusation that had already begun its journey through the hospital's gossip network like wildfire through dry grass. "I know how this looks," she said quietly, meeting Dr. Harrison's gaze. "I know what everyone's thinking." "What I'm thinking," he replied, pulling up a chair beside her bed, "is that you've been through tremendous trauma, both recent and ongoing. Sometimes our minds try to make sense of senseless events by creating patterns, assigning blame, finding reasons where none exist." There it was. The gentle dismissal dressed as medical wisdom. Lora had heard variations of this speech before, not just from Dr. Harrison, but from the parade of psychiatrists, social workers, and well-meaning relatives who'd tried to help her process the original accident. A drunk driver running a red light, her car crushed against a telephone pole, her spine severed in an instant of twisted metal and shattered glass. Random violence that served no purpose, explained nothing, meant nothing beyond the simple fact that sometimes terrible things happen to people who didn't deserve them. But what if it hadn't been random? What if there had always been a pattern, one that she'd been too trusting to see? "Dr. Harrison," she said carefully, "what do you know about my sister?" His expression didn't change, but she caught something. A tiny hesitation, a slight tightening around his eyes. "Maya's been very devoted to your care. She speaks with us regularly, stays informed about your progress. Not all families are so involved." "That's not what I asked." The silence stretched between them, filled with the ambient sounds of the hospital, monitors beeping, conversations in the hallway, the distant hum of machinery keeping people alive. Dr. Harrison removed his glasses and cleaned them meticulously, a gesture she'd learned meant he was choosing his words carefully. "Lora, I want you to consider the possibility that you're looking for someone to blame because blame implies control. If Maya pushed you, then someone made a choice, and choices can be prevented, avoided, fought against. But if you simply fell, if your wheelchair malfunctioned or you took the corner too quickly, then it was just another random event in a series of random events, and that's much harder for the human mind to accept." She wanted to argue, to insist that she knew the difference between falling and being pushed, between accident and intention. But the doubt crept in anyway, the way it always did when people she trusted looked at her with that particular combination of patience and pity. What if she was wrong? What if grief and isolation had finally driven her to the edge of paranoia her family kept insisting she was approaching? After Dr. Harrison left, Lora lay staring at the ceiling and thinking about the woman she'd been before the accident. 25 years old, working as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm, living in a converted warehouse apartment downtown with exposed brick walls and enormous windows that let in floods of natural light. She was planning to move to Portland, had already given her boss notice and started packing her art supplies into carefully labeled boxes. Maya had been supportive then, helping her research neighborhoods and job prospects, even offering to help with the move.
The memory felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else entirely. That Lora had been naive, trusting, incapable of seeing the shadows that lived behind familiar smiles. This Lora, the one who measured her days in physical therapy sessions and doctor's appointments, had learned to be suspicious of kindness, to question motives, to wonder if the people who claimed to love her might actually wish she would disappear. Maya arrived at noon, as predictable as the lunch cart. She swept into the room carrying flowers and wearing the kind of designer scrubs that suggested competence and compassion in equal measure, her golden hair pulled back in a perfect bun that wouldn't have looked out of place in a medical drama. Everything about her presentation was calculated to convey the image of a devoted sister, a healthcare professional, a woman incapable of the violence Lora had accused her of. "Oh, honey," Maya said, her voice breaking with perfectly calibrated emotion. "I was so scared when I got the call. How are you feeling?" She moved to embrace Lora, but something in her sister's posture made her hesitate. Instead, she placed the flowers on the bedside table and settled into the visitor's chair, her expression shifting from concern to careful assessment. "I'm alive," Lora replied flatly. "Don't say it like that. Don't make it sound like—" Maya's voice trailed off, but the implication hung between them. "Don't make it sound like someone wanted you dead." "Like what, Maya? Like someone pushed me down the stairs?" Her sister's face went very still, the practiced mask of concern slipping just enough to reveal something harder underneath. "Security told me what you said to that guard. Lora, you have to understand how that sounds, how it makes our whole family look. How it makes you look, you mean." "I'm trying to help you." Maya leaned forward, her voice dropping to the urgent whisper she used when discussing confidential patient information. "Do you have any idea what people are saying? The rumors that are already starting? I have a career here, a reputation. If people think I'm capable of hurting my own sister—" "Are you?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Maya's face went white, then flushed with anger. "How can you even ask me that? After everything I've done for you, all the times I've been there when Mom and Dad couldn't handle watching you struggle, all the strings I've pulled to get you the best care?" "All the times you've been there," Lora repeated slowly. "You know, that's interesting. You've been there for every major setback, every complication, every time something went wrong with my treatment. My physical therapist mentioned that. She said it was unusual how often you showed up right after something happened." Maya stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "I can't believe you're doing this. Mom warned me that you were getting paranoid, but I thought she was exaggerating." "Mom knows?" "Of course she knows. We've all been worried about you, watching you spiral into these conspiracy theories. Do you think we haven't noticed the way you flinch when people touch you? The way you watch us like we're strangers? You need help, Lora. Professional help." The conversation was following a script that Maya had clearly rehearsed, each response designed to paint Lora as mentally unstable while positioning herself as the long-suffering saint. It was masterful, really. The way she managed to sound both hurt and compassionate, the way she made Laura's accusations sound like symptoms rather than revelations. But there was something else, something Maya couldn't quite hide behind her performance. Fear. Not the fear of someone falsely accused, but the fear of someone whose carefully constructed lies were beginning to crumble. "Get out," Lora said quietly. "Lora, get out. Now." Maya hesitated at the door, her hand on the handle. "I love you," she said, and for a moment her voice sounded almost genuine. "I'm going to get you the help you need, whether you want it or not." After she left, Lora lay in the growing afternoon shadows, replaying every conversation, every interaction, every moment of the past 18 months when Maya had been inexplicably present. The night of the original accident, when Maya had been the first family member to arrive at the emergency room. The complications during surgery that had extended her hospital stay by 2 weeks. The infection that had nearly killed her during rehabilitation. The medication errors that had left her violently ill for days. Each incident by itself could be explained as bad luck, medical randomness, the unfortunate complications that sometimes plagued recovery. But taken together, viewed through the lens of suspicion that her family called paranoia, they formed a different pattern entirely. Not a series of accidents, but a systematic campaign to ensure that Lora remained dependent, vulnerable, trapped in a world where Maya held all the power. The dinner tray arrived at 6, brought by an orderly she didn't recognize. A young man with nervous eyes who avoided looking directly at her. He set the tray down quickly and left without the usual small talk that made these institutional meals slightly more bearable. Word had spread then. She was no longer just another patient. but the woman who accused her sister of attempted murder. The woman who couldn't tell the difference between accident and intention, between care and cruelty. As darkness fell outside her window, Lora made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She was going to prove what Maya had done, not just in the stairwell, but throughout her entire recovery. She was going to document every suspicious incident, interview every witness, follow every thread until she had enough evidence to make people see the truth behind Maya's perfect facade. But first, she needed to survive long enough to gather that evidence. And as she lay in the dark listening to the familiar sounds of the hospitals settling into night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Maya wouldn't wait long before trying again. The first sign that something had fundamentally shifted came at breakfast the next morning. Mrs. Chen, who had been delivering Laura's meals for over a year with the same gentle efficiency, approached her bed with obvious reluctance. Her usual warm smile was strained, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were handling something dangerous. "Good morning, dear," she said, but the endearment felt forced. She set the tray down and stepped back quickly, her eyes darting toward the door. "I hope you're feeling better today." "Mrs. Chen," Lora began, but the older woman was already retreating, her breakfast cart rattling down the hallway with unusual haste. Word had spread then. She was no longer just another patient, but the woman who accused her sister of attempted murder, the woman who couldn't tell the difference between accident and intention, between care and cruelty. Dr. Patricia Vance arrived an hour later, her presence immediately filling the small room with an energy that felt both authoritative and predatory. Lora had heard of Dr. Vance, but never met her. She was the hospital's chief psychiatrist, a woman in her 50s with sharp features and silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her reputation preceded her like a shadow. She was known for her ability to diagnose complex psychological conditions, and for her unwavering belief that the human mind was capable of elaborate self-deception. "Mrs. Winters," Dr. Vance said, settling into the visitor's chair with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "I've been asked to evaluate your recent allegations."
By whom? Your family is concerned about your mental state. Given the trauma you've experienced, both recently and 18 months ago, it's not unusual for patients to develop what we call persecutory delusions. The mind, in its attempt to process senseless tragedy, sometimes creates elaborate narratives that assign blame and meaning where none exist. Lora felt a chill of recognition. This wasn't an evaluation, it was an intervention, carefully orchestrated to discredit her accusations before they could gain any traction. You've already made up your mind about what happened. What I've done is review your medical history, speak with your family, and consult with the staff members who've observed your behavior over the past several months. The picture that emerges is concerning: increasing paranoia, social withdrawal, suspicious behavior toward the very people trying to help you. Such as? Dr. Vance consulted a tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be extensive notes. Your physical therapist reported that you've become increasingly resistant to treatment, often claiming that exercises were too painful or that equipment was malfunctioning. Your nutritionist noted that you've been refusing certain medications, convinced they were making you sick. Your sister Maya has expressed concern about your growing hostility toward family members who've been nothing but supportive. Each accusation landed like a physical blow, not because it was untrue, but because it contained just enough truth to be convincing. Lora had been suspicious of the medications that left her nauseated and dizzy. She had questioned the physical therapy routines that seemed designed to exhaust rather than strengthen her. She had pulled away from family members who treated her like a broken thing to be managed rather than a person to be heard.
You're making me sound paranoid for noticing that things weren't right. Trauma can alter perception in profound ways, Dr. Vance continued smoothly. The brain's threat detection system becomes hypervigilant, finding danger in neutral situations, malice in benevolent actions. It's a survival mechanism, but when it becomes chronic, it can destroy relationships and prevent healing. And if the threats are real, if the malice is actually there, then you'd need evidence, concrete, verifiable evidence that couldn't be explained by accident or misunderstanding. Do you have any such evidence, Miss Winters? The question hung between them like a challenge. Lora realized with growing horror that everything she'd experienced, every suspicious incident, every moment of intuitive fear, could be reframed as symptoms of psychological breakdown. Maya had been brilliant in her campaign, choosing methods that left no fingerprints, creating a pattern that was visible only to the victim. "I want to speak to Marcus Rodriguez, the security guard who found me." Dr. Vance made a note on her tablet. "Mr. Rodriguez reported your statement, naturally, but eyewitness testimony from a person experiencing head trauma and emotional distress is not considered reliable. The brain fills in gaps in memory with assumptions and fears." "Then let me see the security footage." "What footage?" "There have to be cameras in the stairwell. This is a hospital. Everything is monitored." Dr. Vance's expression remained neutral, but Lora caught something, a flicker of satisfaction that suggested she'd walked directly into a trap. "I'm told the camera system in that section has been malfunctioning for several weeks due to the renovation. No footage exists of your fall."
Of course it didn't. Maya would have known about the camera malfunction, would have chosen her moment carefully. She worked here, had access to information that others didn't, could plan around the hospital's blind spots with surgical precision. After Dr. Vance left, promising to return with a treatment plan that would address Lora's underlying psychological distress, the isolation became complete. Nurses who had once chatted about their weekends now performed their duties in silence. The physical therapist who came for her afternoon session was a stranger, a young man who'd been briefed about her condition and treated her with the kind of careful neutrality reserved for potentially violent patients. Maya didn't visit that day, or the next. Her absence was a message in itself. She no longer needed to maintain the fiction of sisterly devotion because the narrative had shifted. Lora was no longer a victim to be comforted, but a patient to be managed, a problem to be solved through proper psychiatric intervention. On the third day, her parents arrived. Richard and Patricia Winters looked older than Lora remembered, as if the weight of having a damaged daughter had aged them beyond their 60-odd years. Her father's once thick hair had gone completely gray, and her mother's face bore new lines around her eyes and mouth. They approached her bed with the careful solemnity of people attending a funeral. "Sweetheart," her mother said, settling into the chair with obvious reluctance, "we need to talk. About what Maya did to me." Her father flinched as if she'd struck him. "About getting you the help you need. Dr. Vance thinks you might benefit from inpatient psychiatric treatment, somewhere you can rest and heal without the stress of these fixations. They want to commit me." "They want to help you," she corrected gently. "We all do. You've been through so much, and it's clear that you're not processing it in a healthy way." Lora studied their faces, looking for any sign that they might believe her, might be willing to consider that their golden daughter could be capable of such calculated cruelty. But she saw only the same combination of pity and exasperation that had become so familiar over the past 18 months. She was the broken daughter, the one who couldn't let go of tragedy, who saw conspiracy where others saw compassion. "Do you remember when I was 12 and Maya convinced me to climb that tree in the backyard, the one with the rotted branch?" Her parents exchanged glances. "That was an accident," her mother said. "Maya felt terrible about it. She told me the branch was strong enough to hold me. She watched me climb up, knowing it would break. When I fell and broke my arm,
She was the first one to run for help, crying about how sorry she was, how she should have stopped me. "Children make mistakes," her father said firmly. "They don't always understand consequences." She was 15, Dad, old enough to know better. And that wasn't the only time. The memories were flooding back now, patterns I'd dismissed as childhood sibling rivalry taking on new significance. The camping trip, when she left me alone in the woods for hours because she said I needed to learn self-reliance. The time she convinced me to eat those berries that made me violently sick. The pool party where she held me underwater just a little too long, claiming we were playing a game. "Stop," her mother said sharply. "This is exactly what Dr. Vance was talking about. You're taking normal childhood incidents and twisting them into something sinister. Maya has always looked out for you. Maya has always made sure I needed looking after. She spent her whole life positioning herself as my savior while creating the disasters I needed saving from." Her father stood up and his face was flushed with anger. "I won't sit here and listen to you destroy your sister's reputation with these paranoid fantasies. Maya has sacrificed her own happiness to take care of you. She turned down a job offer in Seattle to stay close to you after the accident. She visits you constantly, coordinates with your medical team, advocates for your care with insurance companies, and this is how you repay her?"
By trying to expose what she really is? By letting mental illness poison your relationships with everyone who loves you, her mother said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We're losing you, Lora. You're disappearing into these dark thoughts, and we don't know how to bring you back." They left that afternoon, signing papers that would authorize Dr. Vance to proceed with whatever treatment she deemed appropriate. Lora watched them walk away down the hospital corridor, their shoulders bowed with the weight of having failed their damaged daughter one final time. She understood their choice. It was easier to believe in mental illness than to confront the possibility that they'd spent decades enabling a predator. That evening, as rain drummed against her window, Marcus Rodriguez appeared in her doorway. He was off-duty, wearing civilian clothes that made him look smaller somehow, more vulnerable. He glanced up and down the hallway before entering her room and closing the door behind him. "I probably shouldn't be here," he said without preamble, "but I can't stop thinking about what you said in that stairwell. No one else believes me." "Yeah, well, I've been working hospital security for 15 years. You learn to read people, to spot the ones who are lying and the ones who are telling inconvenient truths." He moved closer to her bed, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Your sister's got a reputation among the staff. Nothing anyone would put in an official report, but there are rumors, patterns." Laura's heart began to race. What kind of patterns? Patients under her care who have unusual complications, equipment failures that happen when she's on shift, small things mostly, medications that go missing, dosages that get confused, charts that get misfiled, nothing that couldn't be explained as human error or bad luck. But you think it's more than that? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. "I think Maya Winters is very good at creating problems she can solve. Makes her look like a hero, gets her positive performance reviews, keeps her in control of situations that might otherwise spiral out of her influence. Can you prove it? Not in a way that would hold up in court. She's too smart for that. But I've been keeping informal notes just in case. Times, dates, incidents. Nothing official, you understand, but if someone were to look closely at the pattern..." He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and placed it on her bedside table. "There's something else. I talked to the maintenance crew about that camera malfunction. Funny thing is, they don't have any record of problems in that stairwell. System's been working fine all month." Lora stared at the notebook as if it were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "Why are you helping me?" Marcus's expression hardened. "Because I've got a daughter about your age, and if someone hurt her the way your sister's been hurting you, I'd want someone to stand up for her, even if it cost me my job." After he left, Lora opened the notebook and began to read. Page after page of careful observations, documented incidents, a pattern of suspicious occurrences that stretched back months before her own accident. Marcus had been watching, noting, building a case without realizing it. Other patients had suffered under Maya's care, elderly residents whose conditions deteriorated unexpectedly, accident victims whose recoveries were complicated by inexplicable setbacks, vulnerable people who had no family to advocate for them.
She was not paranoid. She was not delusional. She was the latest in a series of victims, the one who had finally survived long enough and remained conscious enough to recognize the pattern. But recognition was only the beginning. If she was going to stop Maya, she needed more than suspicions and coincidences. She needed evidence that couldn't be explained away by medical professionals who had already decided she was mentally ill. As midnight approached and the hospital settled into its quiet rhythm, Lora began to plan. She would document everything, gather proof, build a case that even Dr. Vance couldn't dismiss as psychological symptoms. But she would have to be careful, because Maya had already demonstrated that she was willing to escalate when threatened. The next attempt on her life would be more subtle, more final. Lora was certain of that. What she didn't know was how much time she had before her sister decided that the risk of exposure outweighed the pleasure of a prolonged campaign. Outside her window, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean while leaving the stains on Lora's life untouched. Tomorrow, she would begin the most dangerous investigation of her life, not just to save herself, but to stop Maya from destroying anyone else. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, when Lora couldn't sleep and decided to wheel herself to the nurse's station for a cup of tea. The night shift was always quieter, staffed by people who preferred the solitude of darkness to the chaos of daylight hours. She'd hoped to find Nancy Kellerman on duty, a veteran nurse in her 50s who'd always been kind to Lora and might be willing to answer questions about Maya's patient history. Instead, she found Derek Santos hunched over a computer terminal, his young face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. Derek was a registered nurse who'd graduated from the same program as Maya, though he'd always lived in her shadow academically and professionally. When he saw Lora approaching, he quickly minimized the window he'd been studying and turned to greet her with obvious nervousness. "Ms. Winters," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you shouldn't be wandering around at this hour. Is everything okay?" "Couldn't sleep," she replied, noting how his hands trembled as he reached for his coffee cup. "What about you? You look like you've seen a ghost." Derek's laugh was hollow, unconvincing. "Just catching up on patient files. You know how it is. Too much paperwork, not enough hours in the day." But Lora had caught a glimpse of the screen before he'd minimized it, enough to recognize the hospital's incident reporting system, the same system that would contain records of every unusual occurrence, every complication, every suspicious event that had happened under Maya's care. "Derek," she said carefully, "can I ask you something? Off the record?" He glanced around the empty corridor, then gestured for her to follow him into a small break room adjacent to the nurse's station. The space was cramped and cluttered, smelling of stale coffee and the anesthetic that permeated everything in the hospital. Derek closed the door and leaned against it, his expression torn between fear and relief. "He knew what you were going to ask before she could speak, and he wanted you to know that he'd been wrestling with it for months, maybe years." "What do you know about Maya?" "I know that she's brilliant. I know that she's saved more lives than most nurses twice her age. I know that patients and families adore her, that doctors trust her judgment implicitly, that the hospital administration considers her indispensable." He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. "I also know that people die when they shouldn't, and Maya's always there when it happens." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation neither of them was quite ready to voice. Lora felt her pulse quicken, the first real confirmation that her suspicions weren't the product of a traumatized mind seeking patterns in chaos.
"Tell me," she said. Derek pulled up a chair beside her wheelchair, his movements careful and deliberate. "It started during our internship. Maya was always the best of us, quickest to diagnose, fastest to respond, most competent under pressure. But there were these moments, these tiny things that didn't quite make sense. A patient would crash during her shift, and she'd be the hero who brought them back. Equipment would malfunction at exactly the wrong moment, and Maya would step in with alternative solutions that saved the day."
You think she was causing the problems she solved? I think Maya discovered early on that being a hero requires victims to save, and she got very, very good at creating situations that showcased her abilities. Derek's voice was barely audible, as if speaking the words too loudly might make them real in a way that couldn't be taken back. Mrs. Patterson, elderly woman with pneumonia. Should have been a straightforward recovery, but her IV line kept getting infected. Maya worked double shifts to monitor her, hand-selected her medications, became like a daughter to her. Mrs. Patterson's family was so grateful when she finally recovered. But I was the one who found the contaminated saline bags in Maya's locker, hidden behind her personal items, sealed but clearly tampered with. When I asked her about it, she said she was collecting evidence of a supply chain problem, planning to report it to administration. Laura's stomach clenched. Did you believe her? I wanted to. God, I wanted to, because the alternative was... He shook his head. 3 weeks later, Mr. Jameson came in after a heart attack. Routine procedure, good prognosis, but his blood pressure kept spiking unpredictably. Maya was his primary nurse, stayed with him around the clock, caught every crisis before it became critical. The family nominated her for a Nursing Excellence Award. And you found something then, too? Empty vials of epinephrine in the medical waste from his room, way more than should have been used for his treatment protocol. When I checked his chart against the pharmacy records, there were discrepancies, small ones, but consistent. Derek reached into his pocket and pulled out a flash drive, turning it over in his hands like a talisman. I've been documenting incidents for 2 years, not enough to prove anything definitively, but enough to show a pattern. Patients under Mine's direct care have a statistically significant higher rate of complications, followed by dramatic recoveries. Equipment failures happen more frequently on her shifts. Medication errors cluster around her patient assignments. Why didn't you report it? To whom? Maya's the golden child of this department. She has commendations from patients, praise from doctors, support from administration. I'm a junior nurse with a history of academic struggles and performance anxiety. Who would they believe? Laura understood the calculation. Maya had spent years building her reputation as the perfect nurse, the dedicated professional, the woman who went above and beyond for her patients. Any accusation against her would seem like jealousy, spite, or professional rivalry from a lesser colleague. But you kept collecting evidence. I kept hoping I was wrong, that there was some other explanation, some way to make sense of the patterns without accepting that someone I worked with, someone I'd considered a friend, was deliberately hurting people. Derek's voice cracked slightly. Then I heard about your accident and the way Maya talked about it during break, how devastated she was, how guilty she felt for not being able to prevent it.
What did she say exactly? She said you'd always been reckless, even as a kid, that you took unnecessary risks, didn't listen to safety warnings. She made it sound like the accident was inevitable, like she'd been waiting for something like it to happen. Derek met Laura's eyes, but the way she said it, there was something underneath the grief, something that sounded almost like satisfaction. The revelation hit Lora like a physical blow. Maya hadn't just caused her accident, she'd been planning for it, expecting it, perhaps even looking forward to it. The drunk driver might have been random chance, but Maya had been waiting for any opportunity to step into the role of devoted sister, caring for her helpless sibling. There's more, Derek continued. I started paying attention to your visits here, the complications you experienced. The infection that nearly killed you, I checked the cultures. The bacteria strain was unusual, not something you'd typically see in a post-surgical patient, more consistent with deliberate introduction. She was poisoning me, slowly, carefully, in ways that looked like normal complications, just enough to keep you dependent, to keep you coming back, to maintain her position as your primary advocate and caregiver. Derek handed her the flash drive. Everything's on here. Patient records, medication discrepancies, statistical analyses, timeline correlations. It's not enough to convict her in court, but it's enough to start an official investigation. Lora stared at the small device, understanding that it represented both salvation and enormous danger. If Maya discovered that evidence existed, if she realized that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling, she wouldn't hesitate to eliminate the threat permanently. "Why are you giving this to me? Why risk your career?" Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Because 3 months ago, I was assigned to care for a little girl, 7 years old, car accident, similar injuries to yours. Maya took a special interest in her case, volunteered to help with her physical therapy, spent extra time with the family." His voice broke completely. "Emma didn't make it. Sudden cardiac arrest during what should have been a routine procedure. Maya was the one who tried to save her, worked on her for 40 minutes straight. The family was so grateful for her efforts. But I think Emma was getting better too quickly. I think her recovery was threatening Maya's narrative of being the indispensable caregiver. And I think Maya decided that a heroic failure was better than losing control of the situation." The magnitude of Maya's crimes began to crystallize in Lora's mind. Not just attempted murder, but a pattern of medical abuse spanning years, targeting the most vulnerable patients in the hospital. People who were already suffering, already dependent on the system for survival. Perfect victims who couldn't fight back. "We have to stop her," Lora said. "We have to be careful. Maya's not stupid. She's survived this long by being meticulous, by covering her tracks, by ensuring that anyone who might threaten her looks unreliable or mentally unstable." Derek glanced toward the door. "She's already started the process with you. The psychiatric evaluation, the family intervention, the narrative that you're suffering from trauma-induced paranoia. Dr. Vance is a good doctor who genuinely wants to help people, but she's also someone who believes in the power of the human mind to create elaborate delusions. Maya fed her a story about your declining mental health, backed it up with carefully selected evidence, and let Dr. Vance reach her own conclusions." A sound in the corridor made them both freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching the break room. Derek quickly pocketed the flash drive and moved to the coffee machine, busying himself with preparing a fresh pot. Lora wheeled herself toward the door, trying to look casual despite her racing heart. The footsteps passed without stopping, but the moment of fear reminded them both how dangerous their conversation had become. If Maya discovered what they were discussing, if she realized that her secrets were no longer safe, the consequences would be swift and final. "I need to get back to my rounds," Derek said, but his tone carried a different message. They couldn't be seen together, couldn't risk arousing suspicion before they had a chance to act on the evidence. "Derek," Lora said as he reached for the door handle, "thank you." He nodded without looking back. "Just be careful. Maya's already tried to kill you once. If she realizes you're still a threat, she won't hesitate to try again." After he left, Lora sat alone in the break room, the flash drive hidden in the folds of her hospital gown like a secret heartbeat. The evidence it contained could destroy Maya's career, expose her crimes, save future victims from becoming pawns in her twisted game of heroism and control. But first, Lora had to survive long enough to use it. She thought about Emma, the 7-year-old girl whose only crime had been recovering too quickly from her injuries. About Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Jameson and all the other patients whose names Derek hadn't mentioned. People who had suffered and died to feed Maya's need for validation and control. About herself, lying broken in a stairwell while her sister's footsteps retreated into darkness. The pattern was clear now, undeniable even to the most skeptical observer. Maya Winters was not a dedicated nurse or loving sister. She was a predator who had turned healing into hunting, who had weaponized care itself against the people who trusted her most. But patterns could be broken.
Evidence could be presented. Truth, no matter how carefully buried, had a way of surfacing when enough people started digging in the right places. As dawn approached and the hospital began to stir with the change of shifts, Lora made her way back to her room with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since before the accident. She had work to do, people to contact, a case to build that would be strong enough to penetrate the wall of disbelief that surrounded Maya's perfect reputation. The war for her life was far from over, but for the first time since that night in the stairwell, she felt like she might actually win it. Dr. Harrison arrived for his morning rounds at precisely 9 o'clock, his usual punctuality now carrying an undertone of professional concern that hadn't been there before Dr. Vance's evaluation. He reviewed her charts with careful attention, asked about her pain levels and sleep patterns, inquired about her emotional state with the delicate precision of someone walking through a minefield. "Your physical recovery is progressing well," he said, settling into the visitor's chair with obvious reluctance. "But I have to ask, how are you feeling mentally? Dr. Vance mentioned that you might benefit from some additional support." Lora had been preparing for this conversation since Derek's revelations, understanding that her response would determine whether she was seen as a recovering patient or a psychiatric case requiring intervention. She needed to appear stable, rational, cooperative, someone whose testimony might be taken seriously when the time came to present Derek's evidence. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about the stress I've been under, the way trauma can distort memory and perception. Dr. Vance helped me understand that my mind might have been trying to make sense of senseless events by creating explanations that weren't really there." Dr. Harrison's expression brightened slightly. "That's very insightful. It takes courage to examine our own thoughts objectively, especially when we're dealing with such difficult circumstances. I want to get better. I want to rebuild my relationship with my family, especially with Maya. She's done so much for me, and I've repaid her kindness with suspicion and accusations." The words tasted like poison in my mouth, but they had the desired effect. Dr. Harrison relaxed visibly, the tension leaving his shoulders as he leaned back in his chair.
"I'm glad to hear you say that. Your sister has been incredibly worried about you. She's spoken with me several times about her concern for your mental health, her fear that you were becoming isolated and paranoid." She was right to be concerned. I can see that now. They talked for another 20 minutes, Dr. Harrison making notes about her improved insight and willingness to engage with treatment. By the time he left, Lora had successfully repositioned herself as a cooperative patient who was responding well to psychiatric intervention rather than a troublemaker making wild accusations. But the performance had cost her. Each word of praise for Maya had felt like swallowing glass, each expression of gratitude like betraying every instinct that had kept her alive. She understood now why Derek had waited so long to speak up, why other staff members had remained silent despite their suspicions. Maya's reputation was a fortress built on years of carefully curated heroism, and attacking it required more than evidence. It required the courage to be branded as jealous, delusional, or malicious. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Marcus Rodriguez appeared in her doorway wearing his security uniform, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes carrying a message that made her pulse quicken. He closed the door behind him and approached her bed with the casual demeanor of someone making routine rounds. "Afternoon, Miss Winters. How are you feeling today?" "Better," she replied, understanding that they were speaking in code now, their conversation potentially monitored by people who would use any suspicious statements against her. Much more clear-headed. "That's good to hear. I wanted to follow up on your concerns from the other day. I've done some checking into the incident in the stairwell." Marcus pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages, his actions visible to anyone who might be watching, but his words pitched low enough to remain private. "Interesting thing about those camera malfunctions. Turns out the maintenance logs don't match what we were told about the system being down. Laura's heart began to race, but she kept her expression neutral. Oh? Cameras were working fine that day. In fact, they captured some very interesting footage that shows exactly what happened in that stairwell and who was responsible. The implications hit her like lightning. Maya had lied about the camera malfunction, assuming that no one would think to check the actual maintenance records. But Marcus had done exactly that, and now there was video evidence of the assault, concrete proof that couldn't be dismissed as the delusions of a traumatized patient. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we follow proper procedures. Evidence gets reviewed, statements get taken, reports get filed." Marcus closed his notebook and returned it to his pocket. "But I wanted you to know first. You were right about what happened, and soon everyone else will know it too." After Marcus left, Lora sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what he'd revealed. Video evidence of Maya pushing her down the stairs would be impossible to explain away, undeniable proof of attempted murder that would shatter her sister's carefully constructed facade in an instant. But it would also be the trigger for Maya's most desperate response. A predator backed into a corner was the most dangerous kind. As if summoned by her thoughts, Maya appeared in the doorway just as the afternoon shift change was beginning. She looked different somehow, less polished, more frayed around the edges, as if the stress of maintaining her performance was finally beginning to show. Her golden hair was slightly disheveled, her usually perfect makeup showing signs of hasty application, and there was something wild in her eyes that Lora had never seen before. "Hello, sister," Maya said, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. "We need to talk."
Maya's transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. The veneer of the perfect nurse, the devoted sister, had finally begun to crack under the pressure of mounting evidence and growing scrutiny. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying Laura's face with the calculating intensity of a predator reassessing its prey. "You've been busy," Maya said, moving into the room with measured steps, making friends, telling stories, convincing people to believe your version of events. "I've been recovering," Lora replied carefully, hyper-aware that they were alone and that Maya had closed the door. "Following my treatment plan, working with Dr. Vance on my issues." Maya's laugh was sharp, brittle. "Your issues. Yes, let's talk about those." She settled into the visitor's chair, but her posture remained tense, coiled. "You know what's interesting about paranoid delusions? They're incredibly persistent. Even when patients seem to be responding to treatment, the core beliefs often remain, just hidden beneath a veneer of cooperation." The words carried multiple meanings, a coded conversation that acknowledged Maya's awareness of Laura's strategic shift in behavior. She knew that Lora was performing compliance while continuing to investigate, just as Lora now knew that Maya's concern was a mask for something far more sinister. "Dr. Vance says that accepting reality is the first step toward healing," Lora said. "And what reality is that, exactly?" "That trauma can distort memory, that grief can create false patterns, that the people who love me have been trying to help, not hurt." Maya leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Laura's face. "You almost sound like you mean that." "I do mean it." "No, you don't. Because I know you, Lora. I've known you your entire life. You've always been stubborn, always been convinced that you could see things others couldn't. Remember when we were kids and you insisted that the neighbor's dog was being mistreated because it was thin? You couldn't accept that it was just an old animal with health problems. You had to create a story about cruelty and neglect. The memory was accurate but twisted, reframed to support Maya's narrative of Lora as someone who manufactured drama where none existed. It was a masterful deflection, the kind that had worked on their parents, on doctors, on anyone who wanted to believe in Maya's inherent goodness. "Maybe I was wrong then," Lora conceded. "Maybe you're wrong now too." They sat in silence for several minutes, each watching the other, waiting for some sign of advantage or weakness. Outside the window, the afternoon sun was setting behind clouds, casting long shadows across the hospital room. The sounds of the evening shift change filtered through the closed door, footsteps, conversations, the mechanical rhythms of institutional care. "There's something you should know," Maya said, eventually, her voice carrying a new note of intimacy, as if they were sisters sharing secrets rather than predator and prey circling each other. "I've always protected you, even when you couldn't see it, even when you resented me for it. Protected me from what? From yourself, from your own self-destructive impulses, from the consequences of your poor judgment." Maya's expression softened, taking on the appearance of genuine concern. "Do you remember the tree incident when you were 12? I tried to stop you from climbing it. I warned you that the branch looked weak, but you were so determined to prove that you were brave, that you didn't need anyone's help." "That's not how I remember it." Memory is unreliable, especially childhood memory. "What matters is that when you fell, I was there. I got help. I stayed with you at the hospital. I made sure you got the care you needed." It was a perfect example of Maya's methodology. Create the crisis, position herself as the hero, rewrite history to support her narrative of devoted protection. Lora wondered how many times this pattern had played out over the years, how many incidents she'd accepted as accidents had actually been carefully orchestrated tests of Maya's ability to control outcomes. "Why are you telling me this?" Maya stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening city. "Because I want you to understand that everything I've done has been for your own good. The accident 18 months ago was a tragedy, but it also gave you something you'd never had before. Purpose, focus, a reason to fight. You became stronger in that wheelchair than you'd ever been on your own 2 feet." "You're talking about my accident like it was a gift? Wasn't it?" Maya turned back to face her, and for a moment the mask slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "You were drifting before the accident. No real career prospects, no serious relationships, no direction in life. You were planning to run away to Portland, like you always ran away when things got difficult. I was planning to start over. You were planning to fail in a new location. But the accident changed that. It gave you challenges to overcome, support systems to appreciate, family members who rallied around you. It made you the center of attention in a way you'd never been before." The twisted logic was breathtaking in its audacity. Maya was suggesting that paralyzing her sister had been an act of love, a gift that provided meaning and purpose to an otherwise aimless existence. It revealed the depth of her narcissism, her inability to see other people as anything more than characters in her personal narrative of heroic sacrifice. "And what about the complications?" Lora asked. "The infections, the medication errors, the equipment failures." Maya's smile didn't waver. "What about them? You survived all of them, didn't you? Each crisis made you stronger, more resilient, more grateful for the people who cared about you. They brought our family closer together. They nearly killed me. But they didn't. Because I was there, because I made sure you got the care you needed, fought for you when others might have given up, stayed by your side through every setback and recovery." It was the perfect circular logic of an abuser. Create the problem, provide the solution, demand gratitude for the rescue. Maya had spent 18 months systematically poisoning her sister while positioning herself as the devoted caregiver, building a reputation for excellence on a foundation of calculated cruelty. A soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Maya's expression immediately shifted back to professional concern as she called out, "Come in." Dr. Vance entered, followed by 2 orderlies that Lora didn't recognize. The psychiatrist's presence filled the small room with an authority that made both sisters straighten in their chairs. "Good evening, Maya.
I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I need to speak with your sister about her treatment plan. Maya stood gracefully, every inch of a supportive family member. Of course. I should probably head home anyway. I have an early shift tomorrow. She leaned down to kiss Laura's forehead, the gesture appearing tender and sisterly to any outside observer. But as her lips brushed Laura's skin, she whispered something so quietly that only her sister could hear. "This isn't over." After Maya left, Dr. Vance settled into the chair with her familiar air of professional calm.
The two orderlies remained standing near the door, their presence suggesting that this wasn't a routine consultation. "Laura, I've been reviewing your case with the hospital administration and your family. We're concerned about your safety." "My safety?" "Your recent accusations against Maya have created a complicated situation. While I understand that you've expressed willingness to reconsider these beliefs, the damage to family relationships has been significant. Your parents are worried that you might be at risk of harming yourself or others if these delusional thoughts resurface." The trap was closing with clinical precision. Maya had anticipated the possibility of exposure and prepared a backup plan that would remove Lora from the equation entirely. If she couldn't be discredited as paranoid, she could be committed as dangerous. "I told you I understand that my perceptions were distorted by trauma. I don't want to hurt anyone." "I believe that's your intention now, while you're thinking clearly. But paranoid episodes can be unpredictable, especially under stress. We think it would be best if you were transferred to our psychiatric facility for intensive treatment." The words hit Lora like a physical blow. Psychiatric commitment would mean isolation from the outside world, loss of credibility as a witness, inability to present the evidence that Derek and Marcus had gathered. It would also put her completely under the control of medical professionals who had already been convinced that she was mentally ill. For how long? Until we're confident that you're no longer a danger to yourself or others. These evaluations can take time, weeks, possibly months. Months in a psychiatric facility would be a death sentence, metaphorically, if not literally. By the time she was released, if she was ever released, the evidence would have disappeared, the witnesses would have been discredited or transferred, and Maya would have had ample opportunity to cover her tracks permanently. I need to think about this. I'm afraid the decision has already been made. Your parents have signed the necessary papers, and Maya has provided detailed testimony about your declining mental state. The transport will arrive in the morning. One of the orderlies stepped forward, producing a small cup containing 2 pills. "These will help you sleep tonight. The transition can be stressful, and we want you to be as comfortable as possible." Lora stared at the medication, understanding that accepting it would mean accepting defeat. The pills would ensure that she was unconscious during the transfer, unable to resist or call her help. They might contain more than sedatives. Maya would have access to the hospital's pharmacy, the ability to substitute medications that would ensure her sister never woke up at all. "What if I refuse?" Dr. Vance's expression remained compassionate, but firm. "Then we'll have to consider you an immediate danger to yourself and authorize emergency sedation. Either way, you're being transferred tomorrow morning." The chess game had reached its endgame, with Maya orchestrating every move from behind the scenes. She'd used the psychiatric system as a weapon, turning Laura's search for truth into evidence of mental illness, her survival instincts into symptoms requiring treatment.
But as Lora looked at the pills in the orderly's hand, she remembered Derek's flash drive, still hidden in her hospital gown. She remembered Marcus's promise that the security footage would be reviewed, that evidence would be presented, that truth would finally emerge. And she remembered Emma, the 7-year-old girl who had died because no one had been brave enough to stop Maya's campaign of medical terrorism. "I'll take the pills," she said quietly. Dr. Vance smiled with what appeared to be genuine relief. "I think this is the right decision, Lora. The facility has excellent programs for trauma recovery and delusion management. You're going to get the help you need." The orderly handed her the cup, and Lora accepted it with steady hands.
She brought it to her lips, tilted her head back as if swallowing, then lowered the cup and handed it back empty. The orderly nodded approvingly and made a note on his clipboard. "Try to get some rest," Dr. Vance said, standing to leave. "Tomorrow is the beginning of your real recovery." After they left, Lora quickly removed the pills from where she'd hidden them under her tongue and wrapped them in a tissue. She had perhaps 6 hours before someone checked on her and discovered that she was still conscious, still able to think and plan and fight for her survival. 6 hours to gather evidence, contact allies, and expose Maya's crimes before disappearing into a psychiatric facility where her voice would be permanently silenced. The war for her life was entering its final phase, and this time, only one of them would survive it. 6 months later, the courtroom was packed with reporters, medical professionals, and family members of Maya's victims, a gallery of faces that represented years of calculated suffering finally brought into the light. Lora sat in her wheelchair near the prosecutor's table, her testimony having concluded the day before with a clarity and precision that had left even Maya's defense attorney struggling to maintain his client's innocence. The evidence had been overwhelming. Derek Santos had presented his meticulously documented files showing patterns of suspicious incidents spanning Maya's entire career. Marcus Rodriguez had testified about the security footage that proved Maya had deliberately pushed Lora down the hospital stairs, while also revealing that he'd been conducting his own informal investigation into unusual deaths on Maya's shifts. Medical examiners had been called to testify about exhumation results that showed traces of foreign substances in bodies that had been buried months or years earlier. But perhaps the most damning evidence had come from Maya herself. When confronted with the mountain of proof against her, she'd finally abandoned her victimized innocence and revealed the cold calculation that had always lurked beneath her perfect surface. In a confession that had stunned even seasoned prosecutors, she'd admitted to over 30 incidents of medical abuse, describing her actions with clinical detachment and expressing no remorse for the lives she'd destroyed. "I gave them purpose," she'd said during her interrogation, the recording of which had been played for the jury. "Before I intervened, they were just suffering meaninglessly. I turned their pain into something significant, made them part of something larger than themselves." The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts: attempted murder, aggravated assault, medical malpractice, and 17 counts of first-degree murder. The families of Maya's victims had wept with relief and rage, finally seeing justice for loved ones whose deaths had been dismissed as medical complications or unfortunate accidents. Maya herself had shown no emotion as the verdicts were read, sitting perfectly still in her defendant's chair with the same clinical detachment she'd displayed throughout the trial. When the judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, she'd simply nodded, as if acknowledging the outcome of a routine medical procedure.
Dr. Patricia Vance published a groundbreaking study on medical serial killers, using Maya's case as a framework for understanding how healthcare professionals could exploit their positions of trust to harm vulnerable patients. The research led to new protocols for monitoring suspicious patterns in medical facilities, computer systems designed to flag unusual incidents, and training programs that taught staff members to recognize the warning signs of colleagues who might be using their access for malicious purposes. The most disturbing aspect of the Maya Winters case, Dr. Vance wrote in her conclusion, was not the calculated nature of her crimes, but the systematic way she used the medical establishment itself as a weapon against her victims. She understood that hospitals are environments where suffering is expected, where complications are commonplace, where death is seen as an unfortunate but inevitable outcome. She weaponized our compassion, turned our desire to heal into a tool for harm. Derek Santos had been promoted to head of nursing quality assurance, his role in exposing Maya's crimes having transformed him from an uncertain junior staff member into a respected advocate for patient safety.
He developed new reporting systems that encouraged healthcare workers to document concerns without fear of professional retaliation, creating safe spaces for the kind of suspicions that might have stopped Maya years earlier if anyone had felt empowered to voice them. Marcus Rodriguez had been recognized with the hospital's highest honor for his dedication to protecting patients and his courage in pursuing the investigation despite pressure from administrators who preferred to avoid scandal. He'd used his platform to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting families of medical malpractice victims, ensuring that other people wouldn't have to fight alone for justice the way Lora had. 3 years later, Lora sat in her new office overlooking downtown Portland, the city she'd originally planned to move to before the accident that changed everything. But she hadn't come here as a refugee from her old life. She'd come as the director of the newly established Winters Institute for Medical Ethics, a research and advocacy organization dedicated to preventing healthcare-related abuse. The irony of using Maya's name for an institution devoted to stopping medical predators wasn't lost on her. But she'd chosen to reclaim the family name, to transform it from a symbol of calculated cruelty into a beacon of hope for vulnerable patients who needed advocates willing to fight for their safety. The Institute had already made significant progress in its mission. Working with hospitals across the country, they'd helped implement monitoring systems that could detect suspicious patterns of patient outcomes. They'd developed training programs for healthcare workers, teaching them to recognize and report signs of colleague misconduct. Most importantly, they'd created support networks for patients and families who suspected medical abuse but felt powerless to prove it. Every victim deserves to be heard, Lora told the audience at the Institute's annual conference, her voice carrying across an auditorium filled with medical professionals, patient advocates, and survivor families. Every suspicion deserves investigation. Every pattern deserves scrutiny, because the alternative, silence in the face of systematic abuse, is not just a failure of the medical system, but a betrayal of everything healthcare is supposed to represent. The speech was met with sustained applause, but Lora's thoughts were already turning to the next challenge. There were other Maya Winters out there, other predators hiding behind white coats and professional credentials, other victims suffering in silence because no one would believe their accusations against seemingly perfect caregivers. 5 years later, the documentary about Maya's crimes premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to critical acclaim and disturbing fascination. Angel of Death, the Maya Winters story, had been produced by a team that included Lora as executive producer, ensuring that the focus remained on the victims and the systemic failures that had enabled Maya's campaign of terror rather than sensationalizing her psychological pathology. The film featured interviews with survivors, family members of victims, and the healthcare workers who had finally found the courage to speak out. It traced Maya's history from her early days as a seemingly promising nursing student through the escalating pattern of abuse that had culminated in her arrest and conviction.
But perhaps most powerfully, it showed the aftermath, the lives rebuilt, the systems reformed, the communities that had learned to protect their most vulnerable members. It demonstrated that even the most calculating predator could be stopped when enough people refused to accept convenient lies in place of difficult truths. Lora attended the premiere in her wheelchair, flanked by Derek and Marcus and dozens of other people who had played roles in bringing Maya to justice. As the credits rolled and the audience applauded, she felt not triumph, but a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served and future victims would be better protected. 7 years later. The call came on a Tuesday morning as Lora was reviewing grant applications for research into medical abuse prevention. Maya had died in prison, found unresponsive in her cell during a routine morning check. The cause was listed as cardiac arrest, though the irony of a woman who had manipulated so many medical crises dying from a genuine medical emergency was not lost on anyone familiar with her case. Lora felt neither grief nor satisfaction at the news, only a sense of closure that seemed appropriate. Maya's death wouldn't bring back her victims or undo the trauma she'd inflicted,
but it did represent the final chapter in a story that had begun with Lora lying broken at the bottom of a hospital stairwell, convinced that no one would ever believe her accusations against her perfect sister. She spent the rest of that day working on a new initiative to expand medical abuse prevention programs to nursing homes and long-term care facilities, channeling her energy into the ongoing work of protecting vulnerable people from those who would exploit their trust. The work was difficult, often frustrating, sometimes dangerous, but it was also necessary, meaningful, and occasionally triumphant. 10 years after Maya's death, Lora received an unexpected package at the Winters Institute. Inside was a collection of letters, dozens of them, written by Maya during her final years in prison, but never sent. The prison warden's accompanying note explained that they'd been found among Maya's possessions after her death, all addressed to Lora, but kept in a private box beneath her bunk. Lora sat in her office as evening fell over Portland, the unopened letters spread across her desk like evidence of a crime that refused to stay buried. Part of her wanted to destroy them unread, to let Maya's final thoughts remain silent as her victors' voices had been. But another part, the investigator who had learned to follow every lead, examine every piece of evidence, knew she had to understand what her sister had been thinking during those final years of incarceration. The first letter was dated 3 months after Maya's conviction. Her handwriting was as precise as ever, each word carefully formed, betraying no hint of the chaos that imprisonment must have brought to someone who had spent her entire adult life controlling every variable around her. "Lora," it began, "I know you'll never read this, but I find myself needing to explain something that I couldn't articulate during the trial. You were always the only person who really saw me, not the perfect nurse, not the devoted sister, but the person underneath all of that performance. You understood that I was different, even when we were children, even when everyone else believed in the mask I wore. Do you remember the day you broke your arm falling from that tree? I had calculated the exact weight the branch could bear, knew precisely when it would snap. But what I hadn't calculated was how I would feel watching you fall. There was terror, yes, fear that I had miscalculated, that you might be hurt more seriously than I intended. But underneath that fear was something else, exhilaration, the intoxicating rush of having such complete control over another person's fate. That was the moment I understood what I was. Not evil, exactly, but fundamentally different from people who felt empathy as an automatic response, rather than an intellectual exercise. You were my first successful experiment in managing human suffering, and every subsequent incident built upon that foundation." Lora set the letter down, her hands trembling slightly. She had suspected that Maya's cruelty began in childhood, but seeing it confirmed in her sister's own words was somehow more disturbing than all the testimony about her medical crimes. The clinical detachment in Maya's description of deliberately breaking her arm was chilling in its honesty.
The letters that followed chronicled Maya's evolving understanding of her own psychology during years of forced self-reflection. She wrote about the other inmates who feared her, sensing something predatory beneath her quiet demeanor. She described the prison psychologists who tried to analyze her motivations, never quite grasping that her actions had been driven not by trauma or mental illness, but by a fundamental absence of human empathy. "The most frustrating part of my conversations with Dr. Marshall," one letter read, "is her insistence that there must be some underlying cause for what I did. Childhood abuse, neurological damage, some explanation that would make me a victim rather than a perpetrator. She cannot accept that some people are simply born without the neurological capacity for genuine compassion. I learned to mimic empathy because it was socially advantageous, but I never felt it. Even now, when I think about the people who died because of my interventions, I feel no remorse, only regret that I was eventually caught." The final letter was dated just a week before Maya's death. Her handwriting had become shakier, less controlled, suggesting either illness or the psychological strain of prolonged isolation. but her thoughts remained crystalline in their clarity. I know that you've dedicated your life to preventing others like me from harming vulnerable people. The irony is not lost on me that my crimes became the catalyst for systems that will save countless lives. In a way, I gave your existence the same kind of purpose that I tried to give my victims: meaning through suffering, significance through survival. But here is what I want you to understand, Lora. I am not unique. There are others like me working in hospitals, nursing homes, care facilities across the country. They have learned from my mistakes, become more subtle in their methods, more careful about leaving evidence. Your institute may stop some of them, but not all. The healthcare system will always attract people who are drawn to power over life and death, who find satisfaction in controlling the most vulnerable members of society. I do not ask for forgiveness because I know I do not deserve it. I do not claim to feel sorry for what I did because that would be another lie in a life built upon deception. What I will say is this: you were stronger than I ever anticipated. You survived not just my attempts to break you, but the systematic gaslighting that followed. You found allies when I thought I had isolated you completely. You built evidence when I thought I had covered every trail. You won, sister, not because you were more virtuous, but because you were more persistent. I hope that victory has brought you peace, even though I suspect, knowing you as I do, that you will never truly rest as long as there are other predators wearing white coats and stethoscopes, hunting among the innocent. Lora finished reading as the Portland skyline twinkled beyond her windows. She sat quietly for several minutes, processing the strange gift of insight into Maya's unrepentant mind. The letters contained no apologies, no expressions of remorse, no last-minute conversion to humanity. They were simply the final documentation from a predator who had never learned to feel genuine emotion, but had maintained her intellectual honesty even in the face of permanent incarceration. She picked up her phone and called Marcus Rodriguez, now retired, but still involved with the Institute as a consultant. "She's dead," Lora said when he answered, "but she's still teaching us." "What do you mean?" "I think Maya was right about one thing. There are others like her out there, and they're learning to be more careful. We need to evolve our detection methods, expand our training programs, develop new ways to identify predators before they claim victims." "You sound like someone who's planning to work even harder." "I am, because if Maya taught me anything, it's that the price of complacency is measured in lives, and I'm not willing to pay that price."
That night, Lora began drafting a proposal for the Institute's next phase of expansion. They would develop psychological profiling tools for healthcare workers, create early warning systems for medical facilities, establish international networks for sharing information about suspected medical predators. The work would be difficult, controversial, and potentially dangerous, but it was also necessary. Because somewhere out there, in a hospital or nursing home or rehabilitation center, another Maya was beginning her career. Another perfect caregiver was learning to weaponize compassion, to turn healing into hunting, to find satisfaction in the suffering of those who trusted her most. And when that predator finally revealed herself, Lora intended to be ready. She placed Maya's letters in her office safe, not as keepsakes, but as evidence of a mind that had never learned to value human life beyond its utility for personal gratification. They would remain there as a reminder of what she was fighting against, not just individual criminals, but a fundamental absence of empathy that could hide behind the noblest of professions. The war against medical predators would continue. It had claimed Maya as its most notorious casualty, but it was far from over. As long as vulnerable people needed care, there would be those who would exploit that vulnerability. And as long as that threat existed, Lora would be there to stand between predator and prey. The broken woman who had once lain helpless at the bottom of a hospital stairwell had become the guardian of everyone who might find themselves in similar circumstances. It was a transformation born of trauma, but sustained by purpose. Proof that even the most calculated cruelty could ultimately serve the cause of justice. Maya had been wrong about many things, but she had been right about one. Her crimes had given Lora's life a meaning and significance that might never have existed otherwise.
The difference was that Lora had chosen to use that meaning to protect others, while Maya had used her power only to satisfy her own psychological hunger. In the end, that choice had made all the difference. Thank you for listening to this gripping psychological thriller about Lora and Maya Winters. This story of medical predation, family betrayal, and the fight for justice reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous people are those we trust the most.